Good evening and welcome to the latest of our series of talks for the RGS Northern Ireland region. Tonight I'm delighted to introduce Paul Clements, who is one of our committee members in the RGS NI and is more widely known as a writer and journalist. Indeed, he's the author of 5 travel books on Ireland, including his most recent one based on a journey along the River Shannon in 2018. Shannon Country, a river journey through time, was published by Lilliput Press at the end of 2020. And as Paul will explain, for this trip, he was traveling in the footsteps of another writer, Richard Hayward, who wrote his own book about the River Shannon journey in 1940. In 2014, Paul wrote a biography of Richard Hayward, so he has had a long time interest in his life and writing. In this illustrated talk tonight, he will outline his route and delve into a variety of subjects relating to the river. These include the landscape and topography, its history, heritage, and culture, as well as looking at the natural world, particularly birds, and he's also going to dip his toe into the musical world. In fact, the talk starts with some music. To get us in the mood, we are firstly going to hear a song from the famous Irish tenor John McCormack, singing Where the River Shannon Flows, recorded around 1913, which is overlaid with pictures of Paul's journey across the river. Following Paul's talk, there will be a live Q&A session on Zoom.
Pretty spot in Ireland I always claim for my land, where the fairies and the blarney will never, never die. It's the land of the Shillelagh. Me heart goes back there dearly to the girl I left behind me when we kissed and said goodbye. Where dear old Shannon's flowing, where the 3-leaved shamrocks grow, where me heart is, I am going to my little Irish rose. And the moment that I meet her, with a hug and kiss, I'll greet her, for there's not a calling sweeter, where the river Shannon flows. Sure, no letter I'll be mailing, for soon will I be sailing, and I'll bless the ship that takes me to my dear old Erin shore. There I'll settle down forever, I'll leave the old fog never, and I'll whisper to my sweetheart, come and take me name a store, where dear old Shannon's flowing, where the 3-leaved shamrocks grow, where me heart is, I am going to me little Irish rose. And the moment that I meet her, with a hug and kiss, I'll greet her, for there's not a calling sweeter, where the river Shannon flows.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a talk about my journey along the River Shannon, recorded in this book, which you can see on the screen, Shannon Country, A River Journey Through Time. And the journey recorded in this book was based on a trip in the footsteps of the writer, actor and singer Richard Hayward, who went along the Shannon 80 years ago to make a film and to write his own book about the river. And the cover of my book corresponds to the cover of Hayward's book, where the River Shannon flows, also with a round tower, and his journey was made in 1939. Hayward's title came from the song that you've just heard earlier by John McCormack, and that was his statue that we saw at the end of the DVD, which is in Athlone and was erected in 2014. So for my journey in 2018, I steeped myself in this book and absorbed what Hayward had seen and what mattered to him. It was the perfect excuse to go footstepping, visiting places that he had been to, and to see how they've changed over the decades. So Richard Hayward hired a caravan which was towed by an Austin car, and they set out in mid-August 1939 for what would be a journey of about 3 weeks, right up to early September. And the caravan, this is the receipt for it here, the caravan was at Cheltenham, and it cost £12 from the Irish Caravan Company in Belfast, where he lived. I spent much longer over an intermittent period of time on my journey. I didn't have a caravan, but I went by car, by bicycle, on foot, and by boat. Richard Hayward was accompanied by a photographer, a film cameraman, and a woman who produced this map, which appeared in the back cover of the book. So the Shannon is 225 miles. It's the longest river in either Ireland or Britain, as I'm sure all the geographers know. You can see up here, the Shannon Pot is in this area, which is very near the border with County Fermanagh. It's in Cavan, and it is right beside Quilca Mountain, which overlaps between Cavan and Fermanagh. And that's where Hayward started his journey. And the three main lakes, I'll just identify them now for you. This is Loch Allen in the north, Loch Ree in the Midlands, the Mid-Shannon, and down here is Loch Derg in the lower Shannon, which then leads out through Limerick and the estuary out to the ocean and the Atlantic. So I also began my journey at the Shannon Pot, and I took a slightly different approach to Richard Hayward's. There's a lot of speculation about where the source of the river is and whether it's in County Cavan or in County Fermanagh. And this has been documented in many books and television and radio programs. I wasn't so much interested in that because, as I said, it's already been covered and I wanted something different. And the something different I got came in the form of a group of women who gathered at the Shannon Pot to indulge in the practice of geomancy, which interprets markings on the ground. And the women celebrate the water and its transcendental energy, so they are disciples of the natural magic found beside water. And they were made up of Wiccas, water witchers, sound healers, and shamans, while some others indulge in dowsing on the bridges. So what these women do is they tap into the tree energies of the willows. There's a lot of willow trees around the Shannon Pot. They shake the water into the infant river. This was a fine spring evening when I was here, and if the pot is a bit dry, it might benefit from some extra water. And they regard the space around it as a bounty of magnificent energy and a place of healing power. And as part of their ceremony, they light candles, which heightens the magnetic field and stimulates them by sharpening their senses and helping their feng shui. Shannon means, in translation, Shiona, or the salmon of knowledge, and she appeared in mermaid form to one of the women while we were there. I didn't see her myself, I have to say, but all this gave my journey a bit of a kickstart. It also helped considerably when I managed to slip or stumble over a tussock and fell down into the pot itself. I slipped down the bank. I didn't get my feet wet, but I just had a little tumble, which gave the women something to keep them amused. While I went out on water on boat trips, I also followed the river on foot, as I mentioned, and by bike. And this is what's known as the Snake in the Lake, which is at Acres Lake in Drumshanbo, near the northern lake of Loch Allen. This is a newly opened boardwalk on the Blue Way, which takes you to Leitrim village. And this reflects that the recreation has, to a large extent, taken over a lot of activities on the Shannon. There's not so much angling or fishing nowadays. There used to be a lot of major competitions years ago. But the river is now a place for kayakers and canoeists, stand-up paddleboarders, and much more in the way of experiential activities. Although my quest was for Richard Hayward, there was also a mini quest within the journey. I've had a long-term interest in ornithology, and one of the themes was to spot specific birds. The corncrake, for example, has now gone completely from the Midlands of Ireland, and the curlew is on the brink of extinction. So the leitmotif in my book was trying to see a kingfisher. And I thought that the Shannon might present an opportunity to spot this charismatic, but also very elusive bird, since they populate parts of the river. I did see a lot of herons and dippers and grey wagtails, many other birds associated with rivers, but I kept coming across references to the kingfisher, and there's one on this signpost. I'll just show you the close-up of it here. This is called the Kingfisher Cycle Trail, and it goes through parts of Donegal, Cavan, Leitrim, Fermanagh, and a couple of other areas. And this was in the town of Drumshanbo, where this sign is. It's a route that's not so much used nowadays, but they still have the signage. It's been replaced more so by the blueways. Throughout my journey, music played a big part in it, and a part in Richard Hayward's life too. I came across a music event called the Shannon Sessions, which is held every couple of years, and this is in the Landmark Hotel in Carrick-on-Shannon, where I found a few musicians who were aware of Hayward's work and of his recordings. He was a renowned singer in his day. The weekend that's held takes over 15 pubs throughout Carrick. I didn't manage to get around them all, but they loved Hayward visiting this area, and they still remember him coming there. They remember hearing about him coming there. He was made a free man of Carrick-on-Shannon for his work in promoting the inland waterways and the Shannon in general when no one else was writing about it. Around the late 1930s, Hayward was singing with a number of different women. One was Delia Murphy, with whom he teamed up for 4 years, and they sang all over Ireland. She was known as the Queen of Connemara. This includes, on this list here, you probably can't read it, but one of the songs on it is called Nora Lee, and that was the theme tune that Hayward's party had on his Shannon journey. He also sang widely with Anna Meakin, and they recorded numerous songs. One was called The Shannon Shore, and another was The Shores of Loch Bran, which is a lake near Carrick. They were known as the Irish Troubadours, and these songs were recorded in 1941. So this was just a couple of years after Hayward's journey. He probably picked them up when he was on his trip. And he recorded something somewhere in the region of 150 songs with Decca in London, and quite a few with HMV as well. So he was a leading cultural singer, actor, and writer of his time. Anna Meakin accompanied Hayward on the piano and guitar, and they were very popular. They played and sang together in Dublin quite a bit. And this is a show called A Spot of the Irish, which was held in 1941. There wasn't a lot happening in the north of Ireland because of the war, and a lot of the dancers and artists and singers and musicians gravitated to Dublin, where there was much more going on. So from my point of view, I was looking at the landscape and the river, the islands, which Hayward explored, trying to see them through his eyes. And I also looked at how people, place, and nature are linked. Landscape and riverscape hold many memories. This area is the Black Pigs Dyke, or the Dune as it's called, which is at Jamestown and Leitrim, and you can just see, you can make out the trace of it here in this path. This would originally have been a long Iron Age walled fortification made of earth and stone, and it ran from Donegal over to County Down through 7 or 8 counties. Archaeologists believe that it was built around 200 BC to protect the seat of Connaught from northern enemies. Another school of thought says it was erected to defend Ulster against marauding Connaught men. and its purpose may also have been to act as a short entrenchment, dividing property or making a large-scale cattle rustling scheme more difficult, because livestock in those days there would have been a lot of larceny, and stealing of livestock was very prevalent at that period. So my journey was partly an act of recreation, trying to bring places from the past, not so much back to life, but to consider what they were like in that period through immersion in the past. And one of the things I like to do is stitch together stories, recollections, and testimonies from local people, whether they're historians, librarians, lock keepers, anglers, river experts, farmers, barge owners, whoever they are, and try to create what I call a collective memory map, focusing on social history. So finding the past in the present is not impossible, but it can be quite difficult. A local farmer told me that the name locally for the Black Pigs Dyke in this area is called the Worms Ditch. And the gist of the Black Pig is that a cruel schoolmaster with magical power was transformed into a large pig by one of his pupils, and he was pursued across the countryside, elevating in his wake large indentations in the ground, although not the present linear earthwork, before drowning in the river. Of course, like many Irish legends, there are a lot of variations on that story. There is a startling contrast with the roads of today and those of the 1930s, which were in a terrible condition. Hayward travelled the road from Maruski to Tarmanbarry, which is this road. It skirts the river. This is just a shot of it today, but he complained about the state of the dusty boreens that he drove along, because there would have been no tarmac in those days. They were very basic roads, and they could only reach speeds of maybe up to 10 miles an hour, because don't forget, his car was towing a caravan, so they were quite a party. And he recounts the fact that the limestone dust was thrown up as his convoy made its way along these country back roads. There might have been just a few donkeys on them. There certainly wouldn't have been any tractors in those days. There was just room for his party to pass along this road. I'll just read you his quote from this. "We had not travelled more than a mile of this little road before our car and our caravan, and everything within and without them, lay under a thick layer of white powder, which had such a degree of penetration that for a full 3 months afterwards, when I left this limestone country, it would continue to creep out from the joints and crevices of my car every time it was hosed down. In appearance, we had all aged about 30 years in 5 minutes, for the dust had made our hair and eyebrows quite white. And as we stopped to inquire the way, we were enveloped in a great cloud which stretched behind us as far as we could see." So he wasn't very keen on the limestone dust, as you can imagine. It has since, of course, been sanitized, as we might call it, or tarmac. It's now marketed as the East Roscommon Scenic Drive, while, of course, Ireland itself has been subsumed by motorways. Apart from the road differences, changes in the landscape are something that I was looking at. On Hayward's journey, he refers to a mountain called Slieve Bawn, or it's a hill really. There's not many mountains in the Midlands of Ireland or along the Shannon. They're mostly on the west coast, as you know, or on the east coast. But he was impressed with the solitary mass and elevation of the ridge of hills, which he said looked imposing because of the sudden rise of its upper Silurian rocks from the level of the limestone plain. And for him, it was a bold reference point. And with the single exception of this hill, he compared the country all around it as being as level as the lowlands of Holland. And I suppose one wonders today, this is a shot of it obviously today, because it's taken on a completely different complexion from the bald hill that he knew. You've got, first of all, the Quilcha, which is the Forestry Service. You've got their forests all over it. You've got electricity pylons and, of course, the towering presence of wind turbines. I think there's more than 25 in this hill, as part of a joint €90 million venture between Quilcha and Bord na Móna on the mountain. And that's one of the striking differences, just the look of the landscape. And And in the foreground there, you can also see some of the peat. This is photographs taken near Lanesborough. And at the end of 2020, the government announced that the Board Namona, the company that runs these fields, the peat stations, announced that they were closing the stations down and they're establishing a new green contract with nature. In Hayward's time, it was a completely agricultural country. Board Namona didn't exist until the mid-1940s and did become a major employer, but this whole thing now is being turned around completely in the next few years. At the bridge in Lanesborough, you can have 1 foot in Longford and the other foot in County Roscommon. You can also have 1 foot in the province of Leinster and 1 foot in the province of Connaught. That is assuming you've got 4 feet. Travel writing is often based on footstepping, which has become very popular. And this involves going in the footsteps of someone from a long time ago, perhaps, or in my case, 80 years ago, searching for traces of them to see if any traces remain and finding out if anybody knows anything about them. On my journeys, I focus on what interests me, which is the natural history and the wildlife, the landscape and topography, the built heritage, and the wildlife, of course, music in the pubs we've mentioned. So there's quite wide parameters, but you do have to employ the principle of selectivity. Footstepping is very popular. A lot of people go in the footsteps, for example, of Robert Louis Stevenson on a trip through the Cevennes Mountains in France. In more recent years, people have gone in the footsteps of the legendary travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor, who walked across Europe at the age of 19, I think he was about 18 or 19, in 1934 in his mortal journey that later produced 3 travel books. So as I said, one of my interests is the bird life. One bird that kept popping up both in the water and in this case on the wall in the form of a mural is the heron, and this is the Shannon Bar in Tarmanbarry. A great place I also discovered the evening I was there to find a murmuration of starlings, hundreds of them on the wires that run across the river here at dusk. On the Longford side of Loch Ree, that's the middle lake that I showed you at the start on the map, Michael Casey is a renowned bog oak sculptor, and he brought me around Barry Harbour and Newton Cashel, and we went out to Saints Island. He's been making pieces of sculpture for more than 60 years. He took me to Dernagran Bog, which in Hayward's time, that whole area would have been covered with heather right up to the early 1950s when Board Namona drained it and left it as a cutaway bog, and they removed a lot of trees. Michael showed me around his studio. They call him, by the way, his nickname is the Michelangelo of the bog. And Michael Casey showed me around his studio, and it was here when I went with him there that I spotted, I had another sighting of a kingfisher. Sadly, it was motionless. It wasn't flying anywhere. This one is made from bog yew and has been chiseled, carved, shaped, and sanded to perfection, and then frozen in wood. It is quite a rich tone, as you can see, without the dazzling blueness, of course. But this was on display along with other birds such as the curlew, swallow, snipe, and a variety of mythological creatures. The kingfishers are said to be spirits of good luck. They hadn't brought me much good luck in actual sighting them on the river by this stage of my journey, but they're said to be a symbol of peace and prosperity, and that's where we get the term the halcyon days from. On the other side of Loch Ree, I hitched a lift out to the Black Islands with a man called Paddy Hanley, a local boatman who brought me out to King's Island, where his family lived. And I suppose this is really a classic example, not so much of footstepping, but going in the ripples of Richard Hayward, because he went to the island as well in 1939. Paddy Hanley has been coming back and forth to the island since his school days in the 1940s. He lived with his aunt and his uncle on the island from the mid-1950s up until 1985, when he resettled on the mainland. And on his journey, Hayward met Paddy's aunt Mary Hanley, just seen here, second from the left, and that's Hayward himself. And there were only two families living on the island at this stage, the Hanley and the O'Hara families, who we see here. And this photograph is taken from Hayward's book. Hospitality was traditional in the Ireland of the 1930s, and strangers were made to feel welcome. Hayward described the Hanleys as princely and said he was treated like a king. He was on King's Island, after all, because of the kindness that his party received. And I'll just read you his quote. Mary Hanley made a great meal of good strong tea, fresh boiled eggs and bread, baked by herself, light as a feather and fit for a king. Indeed, it's a cunning hand the same Mrs. Hanley has for the baking, and her husband is a luckier man, maybe, than he knows. So along with a neighbour, Nancy Conroy, Paddy was the last person to leave the island. And today there's 3 single-storey whitewashed farm cottages with asbestos roofs. They had thatch in the days when Hayward was there. And this is Paddy, who lived in the middle house. And he showed me around it. It's in pretty good shape. When I was there, he was testing the market because they were for sale. In fact, the whole island was for sale. I think it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's recognised for its natural wildlife and so forth. And the asking price for the whole lot was €750,000. I'm not sure if they've since been sold. I don't think they have been. The western shore of Lough Ree is the next area we're looking at. And this is Rindoon Peninsula. This was an area that was unknown to me, and it was a pleasure to discover it and to find out about its medieval heartbeat. The built heritage that survives in Rindoon is very impressive in terms of its scale and of the work that has been done to preserve it. This is the main town wall, which is in a venerable condition, given its age dating from the 1250s, when the high wall was built over 500 metres long, and it ran from shore to shore across the peninsula. Originally, the wall had 4 towers and 1 gatehouse, and it replaced an earlier earth and timber defence. That had a gatehouse with 3 square towers projecting out. So the wall was in quite bad condition, but there was a great local drive to do something about it, and it has undergone much needed conservation through local community archaeology work, which has been a great success. There's a lot of interest in protecting the built heritage now throughout Ireland that didn't exist in Hayward's time. He was extremely disappointed in how little interest there was, even in history in general, but especially in protecting the architecture. The castle, which is beside it, was completed by 1235, and this overlooks the harbour for practical and symbolic purposes. And it was strategically important, and just as in Hayward's time, it is still smothered by an overcoat of thick ivy, strangling the walls, and it's closed to the public. Hayward described it as a majestic ruin, but he said from a distance it did not look like any castle at all, but like a clump of trees. Half of the donjon has collapsed, and there's a lot of fallen masonry inside. You can't actually access, you can't go inside, it's not safe. So this is really far too big a project for the local community to embrace or to do something with this. It's really a job for the Office of Public Works in the Republic, which they may turn to at some stage. So a short distance away, the parish church dates from around 1251, and it's a very big nave and a big chancel, and all the ivy has been cleared off this, and the stonework has been pointed. So it's in quite good condition in terms of what remains of it. They probably took the stone to use in some other church. Hayward was of an antiquarian temper, and he loved the ruins and the ancient stone. But when he came here, he was shocked by the crumbling walls. And he said, his quote in this was, "I have never seen in my life such dilapidation and neglect." And it was not until we had hacked our way through the brambles for 20 minutes and we stood beside the 4 walls of the old church to find that they were completely choked with the undergrowth. Excuse me. So this is a sharp contrast to the church that Hayward saw on his journey. As I said, there wasn't really much money around in his day to protect the buildings, and there wasn't really the desire either. We move on to Athlone, and this is the railway bridge, which was designed on the bowstring and lattice principle and has carried trains from Dublin to Galway since 1851. It was built with a central swivel opening span of 37 metres long to accommodate tall sailing craft, and it opened up until the mid-1930s. The engineer who carried out the work was George Willoughby Hemans, and he was the son of the Liverpudlian poet Felicia Dorothea Hemans. She is best known for her poem called Casabianca. I'll just read you its often quoted 4 lines. Some of you may remember it from your school days, some of you may not. The boy stood on the burning deck whence all but he had fled. The flame that lit the battle's wreck shone round him o'er the dead. This is sometimes parodied to read, the boy stood on the burning deck, his feet were covered in blisters. He'd burnt the socks right off his feet and had to wear his sisters. So it's good to have a little bit of humour with your poetry. From Athlone, I wanted to go south to Clonmacnoise, and I had a quandary as to whether to walk there barefoot like a pilgrim or take the Viking boat which runs from just beside Athlone Castle. The weather wasn't terribly good, so the boat won out, and it really is the best way to arrive at a monastic site. You come off the boat and you walk 20 paces and you travel 1,000 years, and you're surrounded by churches, round towers, and a few cattle as well. Clonmacnoise is probably the most revered site along the Shannon, and one of the most resonant sites. Certainly, it's probably Ireland's preeminent ecclesiastical site. The word over-tourism, which we know about today, or we did know about until 2019, would have been unknown in 1939. And Clonmacnoise had around 2,000 visitors that year when Hayward spent time there, and he wrote 20 pages about it in his book. About 30 years later, in 1970, that figure had gone up to 5,000. And then over the last 5 decades, it has risen inexorably to 170,000, which is the last figure available for 2018. And of course, these days, the state and the tourist board like to flaunt and trade in the history and heritage of Ireland. This is now in an area that's been marketed as Ireland's ancient East, and it's also called the hidden heartlands. And there is a new plan in progress, the Shannon Master Plan, to develop it even further. A few miles away in Shannon Bridge, I was off on another quest. I had heard that there was a river connection to the title of Flann O'Brien's book, At Swim Two Birds. He was also known as Miles Nagopoli, and as a long-term Flannerack, I set off to try to find out about it. And I found 2 small islands. This is Curly's Island, the other is Devonish. I'll show you that in a moment. That translates in Irish, Snad Aen, literally swim 2 birds. And this was one of the Mad King Sweeney's resting places between Clonmacnoise and Shannon Bridge. During the Anglo-Norman period, Curly's Island was guarded by the castle of Clonburren on the west side of the river. And At Swim Two Birds is a very funny satirical novel. Excuse me, we'll have a drink. Some of you may be familiar with these books. Some of you may be Flanneracks, I don't know. But At Swim Two Birds was published in 1939. So it has a connection to that year, which interested me in the first place, as well as having been a lover of the book. When it came out, it didn't attract much attention, but it was very bad timing because most of the copies were destroyed at the publisher's warehouse during the London Blitz. And Flann O'Brien was quoted as saying about it, "Hitler, the literary critic, bombed the publisher's warehouse and burnt the stock." But the Shannon landscape in the Midlands itself was also the background to another of his books called The Third Policeman, which is a satire, as also first published in 1967. And it's a very funny book, probably easier to understand it than That Swim Two Birds, which is a bit more surreal and esoteric in many respects. But it's published in 1967, The Third Policeman. O'Brien died with perfect timing for a comic writer on April Fool's Day, the 1st of April 1966, which is now known as Miles Day in Dublin. You have Bloomsday, of course, the 14th of June. So the 1st of April is Miles Day. Now, this is Devonish Island of At Swim Two Birds fame. This is where he got the title from, and it's a quiet part of the river, just with a couple of cattle on it, not many tourists around. And I was delighted to pin it down because it was quite hard topographically to find out any information about it, or nobody locally really was aware of it. And the site here is also said to be where St. Patrick crossed the river into Connaught. As you know, he got around many different parts of Ireland. The flowers in this area are part of the callows. These are the water meadows with a riot of colour of many different wildflowers, scores of different types such as cowslip, bog cotton, wild valerian, the cuckoo flower, willow herb, the water mint, and marsh marigold, which is the emblem of the Shannon area. You also have orchids here, purple marsh orchids, meadow rue, and numerous different types of knee-high grasses and sedges. I can't go into them all now. I don't have photographs of them all to show you, but it's a very rich area for flowers. And I just speak for a minute or two about a major problem connected to the Shannon, which is the flooding. Some of you may be aware of it, because I was looking at contrasts and differences in Hayward's time and today. And while the face of Ireland has become multicultural and would be unrecognisable to anybody from the 30s, the Shannon itself has not really changed all that much. The river still bends and kinks in the same places, and for centuries there has been serious flooding problems, especially around the Callows, around this area. Some of the most devastating floods in recent years were November 2009, the winter of 2015-16, and February 2020, when major storms and rainfall caused severe hardship in homes and businesses, swallowing up gardens and driveways in many counties. And just a little historical tidbit. In the mid-1950s, an American Army engineer was brought in by the Irish government to help solve the problem of the flooding. He was called Colonel Louis Rydell of the US Army Corps of Engineers, and he had experience of taming the Mississippi down to New Orleans, and he was an expert on flood control. And he spent considerable time working out the channels to be dredged in the Shannon and its tributaries, and he suggested an aggressive approach. He conceded that the difficulties were immense, but he was a very busy man, and he eventually ran out of time because he had to get to Pakistan, where he was going to tackle the Indus. But before he left, he emphasized the navigation, fisheries, recreation, and wildlife potential of the Shannon, which he considered to be one of the world's great rivers, which was a tremendous accolade from him to make that point. And of course, they have since developed the recreation side of it considerably in recent years. We'll go back to birding briefly. At this stage in my journey, there was still no sign of the kingfisher, but I did hear the cuckoos very clearly, signalling their presence with loud repeated calls across the Callows. So I moved on to Banagher and decided to seek some advice in the offices of Birdwatch Ireland about the best place to find the bird. And naturally enough, of course, I had another sighting of it. From the cover of their magazine. Here was the bird jumping out at me, having just ambushed a minnow, seen here with a wheel of spray droplets sprinkling from its feathers. But I met one of the officers from Birdwatch Ireland who said that the population of the bird waxes and wanes over the course of the year, and if it's a freezing winter or there's severe flooding or river pollution, this obviously will have a big impact on the birds. In Ireland generally, over the last 40 years, the population of the kingfisher has dropped nationally by about 1/4. So it is a species that is in decline. They like the backwaters and islands in the middle of the river, which is why I wanted to see those islands connected to Flann O'Brien as well, although I didn't see the bird. But the man I met, the officer I met, gave me some advice from a birding point of view, and he said, let the bird find you. Don't sweat over saying it. It may come to you when you're least expecting it. When Richard Hayward reached Portumna, he camped in the grounds of the Belle Isle Hotel. So I thought I'd try to emulate him. The Belle Isle Hotel is no longer there, but this is a glamping pod. Some of you are probably familiar with glamping, and this is the nearest I could get to camping. The date of Hayward's visit to Portumna was the 3rd of September 1939, and he heard on the radio, coming from a house in the main street, about the announcement of the Second World War breaking out. So it was quite a momentous day, and he recorded this in his book. Nonetheless, he continued his journey. I was having a walk through Portumna and the forest connected to the castle there, and I got a tip-off from the birding grapevine that at the harbour in Portumna, there was a strong possibility of spotting a kingfisher. So I made my way to the harbour, and indeed I found a kingfisher in the water. That information was 100% correct, but it wasn't, of course, flying anywhere. On to Loch Derg, the third and probably the biggest lake on the Shannon. And Hayward went out to Holy Island, which you can get a boat. This is Mount Shannon, to tour that island, which I did, just showing you the photograph of Mount Shannon here. A lot of his information was gleaned from reading the work of R.A.S. McAllister, who was Professor of Celtic Archaeology at UCD and was President of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, an esteemed body, and they published widely in scholarly papers and learned journals. Hayward knew McAllister well, and he was influenced by him, and he quoted from his books and his monographs. And he would have deferred to people like this, as well as Harold Leask and Robert Lloyd Prager, who some of you may be familiar with his work. His first book, In Praise of Ulster, Hayward's book, In Praise of Ulster, was published just a year after Prager's famous book, The Way That I Went. So he would have come across these people on his travels around Ireland. One of the areas I visited here was Ballina, Killaloe, and I got another tip off that it was worth going there. The reason was to find a place called the Kingfisher Lodge, a B&B. Unfortunately, it was no longer open, so I had to move on quickly and to one of my final ports of call, which was to Limerick. And this is the Curragar Falls with some geese displaying. And it was in the city that I had what I call my Kingfisher epiphany. By this stage, I was becoming a bit frustrated about the chances of seeing the bird, and I decided to take the advice, let the bird find you. And lo and behold, I did manage to see not one of them, but two of them at my next location. That location was an Indian restaurant in Limerick beside the milk market, and there the birds were. The king of good times. I got a rare sighting, free with every bottle of beer that I bought, so I didn't even need binoculars. We're going to finish off on the other side of Limerick at Mungret with a rather unprepossessing shot of the cement factory. Hayward spent some time here because he'd been involved with a local actor from Mungret called Mick Gleeson. And what he did most mornings was have a swim in the river. He got up early to start his day with a swim in the Shannon. But at this point, it was quite dirty because of the effluent that was coming from the cement factory, and there was a lot of mud around. And he met a postman who's told him that he should go and have a swim. Hayward said he didn't want to swim because he thought the water was too dirty, and the postman said he was wrong. It was the grandest place in the world for a swim. And the quote from the postman was, If it's dirty, it's clean dirt that's in it, and it's the best thing in the world for you. So he did have what he called a mud bath, and he did enjoy a swim in it. And this is just the area quite close by Mungret, which is a creek where he camped at this spot. And the river energized Hayward, set him up for the day and for his journey. And he always wanted to camp and to stay as close as he could to the river so that he could hear it, smell it, see it, and be right beside it. So that's the gist of my journey in his footsteps. Hayward made a film, as I mentioned at the start, and this was shown in many parts of Ireland, and it was very popular and featured alongside his some bigger films of the time. This is the Royal Hippodrome programme in Belfast for spring 1940, where it was shown alongside other forms of entertainment. And Hayward described the contrasting side of the Shannon by calling it a river of songs and wars and lovely lakes. He was a social commentator and he loved historical detail, and his Shannon book was reprinted in 1950 and again in 1989 with a more modern colour cover. So that's a flavour of my journey along the river, of the heritage and the history behind it, and some of the wildlife, and especially the people who are endemic of the Shannon for me and of what it represents. Thank you very much indeed.
So that's the end of the talk, and I'd just like to remind everybody to join the live Q&A on Zoom, which is starting in the next couple of minutes. So I'll see you there.